June 21, 1942. The desert wind swept across the Libyan frontier as British forces reeled from a crushing defeat at Gazala, and the fortified port of Tobruk had just fallen into Axis hands. The Afrika Korps, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, stood at the height of its operational momentum. Supply lines stretched back across the Mediterranean, vulnerable yet functioning. British formations were retreating toward Egypt. The Suez Canal, lifeline of the British Empire, appeared exposed in a way it had not since the early days of the war. In Berlin and London alike, the stakes were unmistakable. Control of North Africa would shape access to Middle Eastern oil, Mediterranean shipping lanes, and the broader strategic balance of the war. At the same moment across the Atlantic, American forces were still preparing for large-scale engagement in the European theater. Among the rising commanders was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., whose reputation for discipline, mobility, and aggressive doctrine was gaining attention. What if, in a reversal of historical circumstance, Patton had commanded Axis forces in North Africa, while Rommel had been placed in a comparable American role? If you value detailed, historically grounded analysis of World War II and the decisions that shaped its outcome, subscribe to support this channel as we explore how leadership, logistics, and strategic culture influence the real conflict before considering how altered command structures might have shifted its trajectory. The purpose is not to romanticize alternate outcomes, but to better understand the constraints and pressures that defined actual decisions. Any serious examination must begin with the structural realities of 1942. Rommel's operational successes in North Africa were remarkable, yet they were consistently constrained by logistics. The Axis supply chain depended on shipping across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to British naval and air interdiction from Malta and Alexandria. Fuel shortages, spare parts scarcity, and long desert supply lines limited sustained offensives. Even at moments of tactical brilliance, Rommel faced material ceilings imposed by geography and Allied maritime power. Patton, by contrast, operated within the industrial capacity of the United States. American production in 1942 was accelerating dramatically. Access to secure Atlantic supply routes, expanding mechanized forces, and growing air superiority created an environment where operational daring could be supported by replenishment. The contrast between Axis scarcity and Allied abundance framed nearly every decision in North Africa. Any alternate scenario must therefore account for these systemic differences. If Patton had commanded Axis forces in June 1942, his emphasis on rapid exploitation and relentless offensive pressure would likely have aligned with existing German doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare. Rommel himself exemplified such doctrine. However, Patton's operational style also depended heavily on assured supply and massed artillery support. In the desert environment, where fuel and ammunition were perpetually uncertain, his aggressiveness would have confronted immediate logistical constraints. The question becomes whether Patton would have adapted his tempo to the realities of Axis supply, or whether insistence on sustained offensives might have exhausted resources even more rapidly. Conversely, placing Rommel within an American command structure introduces different considerations. Rommel's emphasis on forward command presence and rapid exploitation could have thrived with American material backing. Yet American command culture operated within a coalition framework, particularly under General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Political sensitivity, inter-allied coordination, and adherence to broader strategic priorities constrained unilateral action. Rommel's historical tensions with German high command, including disagreements with Adolf Hitler, suggest he might have similarly chafed under coalition oversight, though the American system offered greater institutional flexibility than the centralized Nazi command hierarchy. In North Africa, British resistance under commanders such as General Claude Auchinleck and later Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery ultimately stabilized the front at El Alamein. Montgomery's methodical buildup of overwhelming force contrasted with Rommel's opportunistic offensives. If Patton had faced Montgomery across the desert, the interaction of two aggressive personalities could have intensified operational tempo. Yet Montgomery's advantage lay in secure supply and deliberate preparation. Even a more aggressive Axis commander would still have confronted British naval dominance and the attritional limits of extended supply lines. Operational decision-making in North Africa was deeply shaped by Mediterranean naval warfare. British control of key maritime routes, combined with air power from Malta, significantly disrupted Axis convoys. Without resolving this maritime imbalance, no Axis commander, whether Rommel or a hypothetical Patton, could sustain deep advances into Egypt. The capture of the Suez Canal required not only battlefield success but secure logistical continuity. The structural imbalance between Axis and Allied naval capacity remained decisive. Turning to the American side, Operation Torch in November 1942 marked the first major U.S. ground commitment in the European theater. Patton played a significant role in planning and execution, emphasizing discipline and coordination. If Rommel had instead commanded American forces during Torch, his tactical instincts might have emphasized rapid inland thrusts over cautious consolidation. However, American forces at that stage were inexperienced. Training deficiencies and coordination challenges limited operational options. Leadership style alone could not compensate for institutional learning curves. The subsequent Tunisian campaign demonstrated the interplay between leadership and adaptation. After initial setbacks at Kasserine Pass, American command reforms under Patton and others improved performance. Rommel's historical command during this period reflected diminishing Axis capacity. If Patton had been constrained by Axis shortages, while Rommel commanded a resupplied American formation, the balance of operational initiative might have shifted earlier in favor of the Allies. Yet the broader trajectory of industrial production and maritime control suggests that systemic factors would still dominate long-term outcomes. Examining the Eastern Front provides additional perspective. German strategic focus in 1942 centered on Operation Blue and the drive towards Stalingrad. Resources allocated to North Africa were inherently limited. Even an exceptionally effective commander could not draw unlimited reinforcements from a theater prioritized as secondary by Berlin. Patton, known for demanding resources to sustain momentum, might have encountered the same institutional resistance Rommel faced. The friction between field command ambition and high command allocation policies was a defining feature of Axis operations. Leadership also interacts with political context. Rommel's later involvement in resistance circles and strained relationship with Hitler reflected a broader tension between professional military judgment and ideological directives. The American command environment, while political, did not impose ideological constraints comparable to Nazi oversight. A Rommel operating within American doctrine might have found greater latitude for operational critique without existential personal risk. Conversely, Patton operating under Hitler's centralized authority would have confronted rigid directives that limited flexibility. The North African theater ultimately culminated in Axis defeat in May 1943. Allied control of the Mediterranean opened the path to Sicily and Italy, reshaping the strategic map of Europe. Whether commanded by Rommel or a hypothetical Patton, Axis forces faced cumulative disadvantages in industry, logistics, and coalition depth. The Allied capacity to replace losses, rotate units, and integrate air and naval power created a strategic weight that individual brilliance could not offset indefinitely. Leadership nevertheless influences tempo, morale, and tactical execution. Patton's emphasis on discipline and rapid maneuver revitalized American forces after early setbacks. Rommel's bold desert operations disrupted British plans and prolonged the campaign. Inverting their roles illuminates how command culture interacts with institutional structure. Aggression unsupported by supply collapses. Caution unsupported by initiative stagnates. Effective wartime leadership requires alignment between personality, doctrine, and material capacity. The hypothetical scenario, therefore, becomes a lens for examining the real constraints of World War II. Decisions made in 1942 were shaped by geography, industry, coalition politics, and intelligence limitations. The interplay of these forces defined what commanders could realistically achieve. Swapping personalities across opposing sides does not erase the underlying asymmetry between Axis scarcity and Allied abundance. As 1943 progressed, and the focus shifted to Italy and preparations for a cross-channel invasion, both Patton and Rommel would operate within increasingly complex strategic environments. Their reputations continued to influence enemy perceptions and friendly expectations. The pressures of coalition warfare, resource allocation, and ideological oversight framed every operational choice. Considering how each might have performed under reversed circumstances underscores the importance of systemic context in determining outcomes, revealing that leadership, while critical, operates within boundaries set by economics, geography, and grand strategy that no individual commander can wholly transcend. The comparison between command personalities becomes sharper when examined through the prism of operational doctrine. The German Army of 1942 prized Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, which encouraged subordinate initiative within the commander's intent. Rommel embodied this approach, often pushing forward to assess conditions personally and issuing rapid adjustments based on battlefield developments. Patton likewise valued speed and decentralized execution, insisting that subordinates act aggressively once objectives were defined. On the surface, either commander might have functioned effectively within the other's doctrinal environment. Yet doctrine does not exist in isolation. It is reinforced or undermined by supply, communications, and political oversight. In the Axis system, even mission-type tactics ultimately deferred to directives from Adolf Hitler, whose increasing interference limited operational flexibility as the war progressed. If Patton had been placed in Rommel's North African role after the capture of Tobruk, he would have confronted the decision of whether to press immediately into Egypt or pause to consolidate. Historically, Rommel advanced toward El Alamein despite supply shortages, gambling that speed would prevent British reorganization. Patton's historical record suggests he favored relentless pursuit to prevent enemy stabilization. However, he also demonstrated awareness of logistical thresholds, particularly during his rapid advances across France in 1944, when fuel shortages forced operational pauses. In the desert, without reliable resupply from across the Mediterranean, Patton's insistence on tempo might have collided even more dramatically with reality. An aggressive thrust toward Alexandria without secured maritime support risked overextension and encirclement. The Mediterranean theater cannot be separated from naval considerations. British dominance, anchored in Alexandria and reinforced by Malta-based air and naval forces, imposed attritional losses on Axis convoys. Even at moments when Axis air power temporarily suppressed Malta, shipping losses remained significant. A commander in North Africa did not control these maritime variables. Patton, accustomed to integrated joint operations later in the war, might have pressed Berlin for greater naval commitment. Yet Germany's strategic priorities were centered on the Eastern Front. Admiral Reeder's Kriegsmarine lacked the capacity to challenge British control decisively. Thus, the structural imbalance persisted regardless of field leadership. Considering Rommel in an American context raises questions about coalition command. The American war effort in Europe was embedded within an Anglo-American alliance managed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Operational decisions were influenced by British perspectives, resource sharing, and political sensitivity. Rommel, historically critical of high command rigidity, might have found the Allied system comparatively collaborative. Yet he also displayed impatience with constraints and a preference for operational autonomy. Under Eisenhower's centralized coordination for operations such as Torch and later Overlord, Rommel would have needed to align with broad strategic timelines and diplomatic considerations. The Tunisia campaign offers a particularly instructive lens. In early 1943, American forces faced experienced German units at Kasserine Pass. Patton's subsequent reforms emphasized discipline, improved coordination, and aggressive posture. If Rommel had commanded those American forces from the outset, his desert experience might have mitigated some early tactical missteps. However, American units required institutional learning, improved staff work, artillery coordination, and air-ground integration. Leadership could accelerate adaptation, but it could not instantly compensate for structural inexperience. Air power integration further differentiates the contexts. By mid-1942, Allied air forces were expanding rapidly. Control of the air in North Africa shifted progressively toward the Allies as production increased and coordination improved. Rommel historically operated under fluctuating Luftwaffe support, constrained by competing demands on the Eastern Front. Patton, if placed in Axis command, would have been dependent on limited and irregular air cover. Conversely, Rommel in American command might have benefited from expanding Allied air superiority, amplifying his maneuver-oriented instincts with consistent aerial reconnaissance and close support. Strategic geography also imposed immutable realities. The North African coastline offered limited deep-water ports capable of sustaining large mechanized forces. Tobruk and Tripoli were vital, yet vulnerable. Each additional mile eastward increased Axis supply strain. The British, defending Egypt, operated closer to established bases and infrastructure. No change in field commander could alter distances or port capacities. The calculus of fuel consumption versus resupply defined the operational envelope. By late 1942, global dynamics further constrained Axis prospects. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad absorbed German reserves. The United States industrial base expanded dramatically, with tank and aircraft production outpacing Axis output. Even if Patton had achieved temporary breakthroughs in Egypt, sustaining occupation against mounting Allied reinforcement would have required resources unavailable to Berlin. Conversely, Rommel commanding American formations in the build-up to Sicily or Italy would have operated within an expanding logistical network that increasingly favored the Allies. Personality differences nevertheless illuminate contrasting command philosophies. Patton's emphasis on discipline and symbolic leadership, distinct uniforms, strict codes of conduct, was designed to project confidence and restore morale. Rommel's hands-on reconnaissance and personal risk-taking inspired frontline troops. Both cultivated reputations that influenced enemy perception. German intelligence regarded Patton as the Allies' most aggressive commander, while Allied assessments often highlighted Rommel's tactical ingenuity. These reputations shaped strategic deception, such as the Allied use of Patton's perceived aggression during Operation Fortitude in 1944. If the roles were reversed in 1944, during preparations for the Normandy invasion, the contrast becomes even sharper. Rommel, historically tasked with strengthening Atlantic wall defenses, advocated positioning armored reserves near the coast to counter landings immediately. His perspective clashed with other German commanders who favored deeper reserve placement. Patton, serving under Eisenhower, led Third Army following the breakout from Normandy. Inverting these assignments suggests divergent approaches to defensive preparation and offensive exploitation. Yet once again, the decisive variables included air superiority, industrial production, and code-breaking intelligence, factors transcending individual leadership. The Allied advantage in signals intelligence, exemplified by ultra-decrypts, provided insights into German intentions. Rommel did not benefit from comparable intelligence regarding Allied planning. Patton in Axis command would have remained similarly constrained by limited strategic intelligence. Conversely, Rommel within Allied structures might have operated with greater situational awareness due to shared intelligence networks. Information asymmetry shaped operational choices as much as tactical acumen. Coalition depth further differentiated the sides. The Allied coalition integrated American, British, Canadian, and later Free French forces. Industrial and manpower reserves allowed rotation and reinforcement. The Axis coalition in North Africa relied primarily on German and Italian forces, with Italian units often less well equipped. Patton's ability to impose discipline on multinational formations under Axis command would have been complicated by language, doctrine, and equipment disparities. Rommel historically navigated these challenges with varying degrees of success, yet structural inequalities persisted. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the strategic momentum shifted irreversibly toward the Allies. The invasion of Sicily, the Italian campaign, and the buildup for Operation Overlord reflected cumulative Allied strength. No single commander could offset the strategic convergence of American industry, British resilience, and Soviet offensives in the East. Alternate leadership scenarios illuminate possibilities for tactical variation, but they do not negate systemic imbalance. Evaluating these hypothetical reversals underscores a central lesson of World War II. Leadership operates within frameworks defined by economics, geography, alliance politics, and industrial capacity. Patton and Rommel were both products of their institutions. Their successes and limitations reflected the resources and constraints of the systems they served. The pressures they faced, uncertain intelligence, logistical scarcity or abundance, political oversight, shaped their choices and the consequences that followed. By analyzing how each might have responded under reversed circumstances, the enduring importance of structural factors becomes clear. Aggression without supply falters. Preparation without initiative stagnates. The North African campaign and subsequent European operations demonstrate that while leadership style influences tempo and morale, strategic outcome ultimately rests on the alignment of command decisions with material reality. The interplay between personality and structure remains a defining feature of wartime analysis, offering insight into how World War II unfolded under the weight of both human agency and systemic constraint.